So, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for Cycling Canada's webinar series, Cycling Chat, presented by AFEX, Global Payments and Risk Management Solutions. Today is our fifth episode of the series, titled Facing the Fats, a Rider's Guide to Sport Nutrition. We're very excited to be joined today by Kevin Iwasa-Madge, a registered dietitian and sport nutritionist at the Canadian Sport Institute, Ontario. Kevin has kindly put together a presentation for all of us today, which he will take us through shortly. But before passing it over to Kevin, I wanted to just share a bit of his background and experience in the field, as well as his association with Cycling Canada. So Kevin completed his bachelor's degree in applied human nutrition at the University of Guelph and a master's degree in nutrition communication at Ryerson University. While in Guelph, Kevin wrestled for the U of G varsity team, and following graduation, Kevin competed on the national team for several years and highlighted his career with a fifth place finish at the FISU World Championships. Currently, Kevin is a registered dietitian and strength and conditioning coach working for the Canadian Sport Institute, Ontario, and is a part-time professor at Sheridan College. Kevin also works very closely with Cycling Canada's Next Gen Track Cycling program. So for our listeners today, if you're new to the webinar series, we like to provide an engagement opportunity for all of you to ask questions to our presenters throughout the webinars. So as you'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner of this application, where there is a live chat box, we kindly ask listeners to pose any questions you may have for Kevin within this chat box throughout the webinar, and Kevin will do his best to answer these questions throughout his presentation. However, if he cannot get to them right away, we have allotted roughly 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer any questions posed within this chat box. So without further ado, Kevin, the virtual floor is yours.
Hey everyone. So feel free to type into the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it, and we can make this interactive throughout. And then if we really start to go off on a tangent, I may try to put the questions on hold until the end, but I'll try to answer all of your questions throughout. So feel free to type it in as we go. All right, so what we are going to cover today is a refresher on exercise volume and intensity. And it's tough because everyone's knowledge might be in a slightly different place. So I just want to make sure we're starting off all on the right foot. So we'll do a refresher, and just so we're using the same terminology and you know what I mean when I'm talking about these concepts. We'll do the same thing with carbohydrates and fats, so we're all on the same page. And then from there, I'm going to try to take it a little bit deeper, and you may find that some of it you understand and some of it you don't. That's okay. But I'm going to introduce some concepts. One, the crossover concept. So what does that mean? And again, it's kind of building off of the volume, intensity, carbohydrate, and fat stuff. We'll talk about some of the mechanisms behind adaptations to training and diet and what that means with carbs and fats and volume and intensity, all that. And then at the end, we'll talk about the application. So it can be something that you can put into practice. Hopefully you can take at least one thing away from today. All right, so exercise volume and intensity. And again, just a quick refresher. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but feel free to ask questions. But so we all know what I'm talking about. When I say volume, I'm referring to the duration, time, or frequency of the work we do. So it's how much work, how much training, how much exercise. And when I talk about intensity, it's the difficulty, the load, or the speed of the work. So it's how difficult it is. So it's how much and how difficult is the work. And these are two terms that are inversely correlated. And this is really physiological kind of law. You can't run a marathon at the pace you would run a 100-meter sprint, and you can't, or the other way to look at it is you can't maintain a 100-meter sprint pace for the length of a marathon. So it's just the idea that, if something gets more difficult, you can't do it for as long, or if you're doing something for longer, it can't be as difficult. And obviously that's going to shift between individuals, even within an individual day to day, or maybe you get better, you adapt to something over time. So it's not to say that this relationship can't shift a little, but it's really, they are always going to be inversely correlated. And that's really important so that we don't kind of get into this argument where you just need to work harder or you just need to go faster or something like that, because assuming we are maximizing our effort, at some point there are limits to our abilities. And so again, this intensity volume relationship becomes really important as we talk about this crossover concept moving forward. So remember, intensity is how difficult, volume is how much, and they're inversely correlated. So as intensity goes up, volume goes down, and as volume goes up, intensity goes down. For carbohydrates, you'll see throughout the presentation, sometimes I write it as CHO. That's just a short form for carbohydrate, so I don't have to type out carbohydrate every time. So don't get confused from that. Again, CHO is just carbohydrate. Carbohydrate's a macronutrient. And what that means is that it provides us with energy. So our macronutrients provide us with energy. And in the case of carbohydrates, the energy density is about 4 kcals, or same thing as calories, 4 calories per gram. And so keep that in mind as we start talking about fat, just so you have a little bit of a comparison. So again, 4 calories per gram, and it has a fairly fast digestion rate. And so usually we can digest carbs in less than 2 hours. And so that's also important as we start to compare to fats and then look to apply this down the road. So again, energy density is 4 calories per gram. So if you ate 100 grams of carbs, that's 400 calories, and they digest fairly quickly. Usually you can digest them in less than 2 hours. I'm not going to go too deep into this. This does become really important with the application, but we just only have so much time to cover today. But to get your carbohydrates, you have to think about the different foods that contain carbohydrates. And so really quickly, those are our grains, our legumes and pulses, fruits. Certain vegetables are going to have carbs. There's starchy vegetables, potatoes, corn, things like that. Certain dairy products will have carbs as well. And then obviously your added sugar. So not all carbs are created equal. Some are probably better in certain situations. This isn't an argument to say that you should go eat tons of candy because it has carbohydrates, but it is a source of carbs. So again, those are sources of carbohydrates. Just keeping that in mind as you try to apply some of this, knowing that at some point you're going to actually have to put food in your mouth if you want to get the carbohydrates, which means you have to know what type of food. For dietary fats, also a macronutrient, so again, means that it provides energy. And so in the case of fats, it actually provides 9 calories per gram. So if you remember, carbs are 4 calories per gram, fats are 9 calories per gram. So higher energy density, it provides more calories per gram than carbohydrates. So again, important to remember, but slower digestion rate. So it takes longer to get to those calories. And so we're going to start to draw some comparisons. We know that intensity and volume are inversely correlated. You can start to see the same type of pros and cons with carbs and fats. So carbs provide less energy, but they digest quicker. Fat provides a lot of energy, but it digests really slowly. So do you need quick energy, or do you need a lot of energy, but over a long period of time? And then we'll make decisions, around our training and what we're trying to get out of it and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully you can start to see that relationship as I move through. But again, carbs, less energy, but they digest quickly. Fats, a lot of energy, but they digest slowly. And again, the sources: nuts, seeds, nut seed butters, meats, fish, certain fruits, certain dairy, and then our natural and refined oils. And again, some are better than others. I'm not recommending that you go eat a stick of butter every day, but a lot of different sources of fat for you to choose from there. So that's our refresher. Again, type into the chat if you have any questions, but that's kind of our starting point, so we understand what intensity and volume means and some of the characteristics of these carbs and fats as we move through. So this chart is kind of the start of this crossover concept here. So I'm going to try to flesh that out a little bit, but here we have our macronutrients on the left, so protein, carbs, and fat. I haven't talked about protein yet, but you'll understand why in a moment. And then we're looking at the left side, moving to the right, we're going from low intensity to high intensity. Because we know that intensity and volume are inversely correlated, assuming kind of a standard given amount of effort, because obviously we can do no intensity and no volume that's just sitting on the couch, but that's not what we're talking about here. This would go from high volume on the left to low volume on the right. So low intensity, high volume to high intensity, low volume there. And the reason why I haven't paid attention to carbs too much when we look at any of these different substrate utilization or macronutrient uses throughout, about 2% of our energy is going to come from protein at low intensities. This is assuming we're adequately fueled, assuming we're adequately nourished, we're eating. So if you're in a fasted state, you may start using more than 2% of protein, start eating into your muscle, maybe even using proteins that are usually meant for the immune system as energy, but that's not a good thing. So we're assuming here we're healthy individuals. That's a whole different kind of avenue we can go down. So again, assuming we're healthy individuals, we're going to go from anywhere from 2% to 5% of our energy coming from protein. It's not a lot, so I'm not going to pay attention to it a whole lot here. Not to say protein isn't important. Protein does a lot of stuff in our body, and we actually want it to do all those other things. So we don't want to start using up the protein we eat and the protein in our body for energy, because that means it's not there for our muscles. It's not there for our immune system. It's not there for connective tissue. It's not there for our skin even. So if you're thinking like saddle health, protein does a lot of things in the body. We don't want it to also have to provide us with energy. So it's actually a good thing that we don't rely on protein a whole lot for energy. So again, 2 to 5%. So not a lot of the energy that we're using during exercise. So that's why I'm not going to pay attention to it too much. You won't hear me talk about protein much after this. Now, when we look at carbohydrate, remember that CHO is carbohydrate, so don't get confused there. It's going to go from around like 35, 40% at low intensities, and it's going to ramp up to like over 90%. So it becomes almost exclusively our source of energy at high intensities. That becomes really important to remember that as we become more anaerobic with our exercise, carbohydrates become our kind of almost exclusive. So you can see we get a little bit of protein, you'll see we get a little bit of fat, but almost exclusively we rely on carbohydrates at high intensities. So it's really important to remember. It's going to go from about 40 to like 90, 95% of our energy from carbs. Fats, they're going to go from about 60% at low intensity, high volume. So over half, not exclusive. We're always going to use some carbs, but quite a bit at low intensities. And then you can see how as we ramp up to high intensity, it goes to almost nothing. And this is what we call our crossover concept. So I'm going to graph this out for you now. But again, really what this is saying is that protein shouldn't be a big fueling source. Again, not that you don't need protein, but it's really just not for fueling. So we're really relying on carbohydrates and fats, and those proportions are going to shift, again, depending on their intensity and volume. So hopefully you're all with me still. But some people find it's a little easier. So yeah, sorry, carbs and fats. But it's a little easier if I actually try to visualize this. So this is the same chart basically, but just in graph form. On the left axis, we have fuel utilization. So are we using more carbs or protein? So how much percentage of those we're using. On the bottom, we have intensity. So as we move to the right, more intense. So the same thing as the chart. Fats look like this. So higher use at low intensities and lower use at high intensities, and carbs do the opposite. So you can see that nice kind of crossover thing going on there. So again, carbs drop off, and as we start to do higher intensity, we're going to rely almost exclusively on carbohydrates. That's the crossover concept, and this time we're looking at this by intensity. If we want to take a look at this by volume, and knowing again that volume and intensity are inversely correlated, we can see that we start to use more fat as we do more work, knowing that intensity is going to drop off. We can't maintain maximal or super high intensity over 4 hours. At some point, you're going to have to slow down. So whether that's because you're pacing yourself on purpose, or you go out really hard and then you get tired really quick and then you're forced to slow down. At some point, you slow down, intensity comes down, volume goes up as you do more. We're going to rely more and more on fat. And carbs going to do the opposite. So you can see this same crossover, just the opposite, because we're graphing this by time instead of intensity. And so at low volumes early on, if we're really maximizing effort, we're going to tap into that carbohydrate quite a bit But you can see that it drops off, and at some point it crosses over. And as we approach the 1-2 hour mark, we start to rely really on a lot more fat as we go, because intensity, you can't maintain that maximal intensity for very long. And so again, we start with almost exclusively carbs, but pretty quickly we rely more on fat. So again, crossover concept, this time just looking at it by volume. I'm going to show you a little bit of a deeper look. This one might look a little bit more confusing, but for some of you might be thinking about how this relates to your energy systems. And so that aerobic system relies, this is that same fatty acid curve. It's going to be using fatty acids, or that's more that aerobic system. And then we look at that anaerobic system here. This is where we're relying on glucose or carbohydrates, but specifically blood glucose here. So it's a type of carbohydrate. But we also have our kind of ATP CP system, our high energy phosphagen system. It's called different terms depending on who you're talking to. But that's that real sprint, like this isn't to scale, but that's that system that lasts like 10, 20 seconds kind of thing. And so that's actually our muscle glycogen. And at some point we can refuel that ATP and CP a little bit, but it's not going to last very long at all. So we actually have 3 systems we're playing with. And you can see how if we combine those 2 blue bars, those are our 2 different types of carbohydrates. They combine to be that carbohydrate bar I showed you before. So again, this is if you just want to take a deeper look. If this confuses you at all, just go back and look at the previous graph I showed you, because it's just the crossover concept. I'm just kind of breaking the carbs up a little bit more for those of you who want to look at that anaerobic system and that phosphagen system slightly separately, because technically they're 2 different systems, but both rely mostly on carbohydrates there. So taking that crossover concept, and basically I just explained the same thing across 4 different slides, the chart, and then graphing it by intensity, graphing it by volume, and graphing it by energy system. It's that same crossover concept. But knowing that, and knowing that our volume and intensity and our carbs and our fats are going to correlate inversely like that with each other, we can start to look at this as a bit of a balancing act. And so depending on the type of training, or maybe the type of adaptation you want to get, you can start to make decisions for fueling, because you know actually what fuels the body's going to use. And so you're looking at things like, is this high intensity training or high volume training? Or maybe you're looking at, is this anaerobic training or aerobic training? Or am I trying to get speed, strength, power adaptations, or maybe does this need speed, strength, power, or is this more of a conditioning endurance type of training? And based on those kind of thought processes, or that balancing act, you can start to decide, am I using more carbs or more fats? And at some point you actually look at it more nuanced than that. It's the proportion of carbs and the proportion of fat. So it's not all carbs or all fat, but remember, it's on the spectrum, so it's going to ramp up and ramp down. And maybe you're somewhere in the middle. Maybe you're right near those thresholds where it's crossing over and you need a bit of both. So it's a balancing act again with carbs and fat, and sometimes it's a lot of carbs, sometimes it's a lot of fats, and often it's something in between. Just like our training, you're not always doing 100% aerobic training, and you're not always doing a 100% anaerobic. It's usually a combination of energy systems. So that's the crossover concept. Now we're going to talk about how we can start to manipulate some of this. And it's not to say that the intensity and volume and the carb-fat relationship is ever not inversely correlated. It's always going to follow this crossover. But we can start to actually play with the shapes of these curves. At what point does it cross over? How long can we rely on fat? Or how well can we use carbohydrates in these different kind of training zones or different types of training? And a lot of that's going to depend on our kind of conditioning status, or our training status, or the types of training we've been doing, how we're adapting to training, or the types of diets we're following, the food and the substrates we're providing. And so we'll start with training, because this is actually a little bit simpler, and often we're going to go down a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of adaptations to diets. But I don't want us to forget that, there's a saying, exercise is the forgiver of many sins. Training is good, and don't forget about training hard because you're getting really caught up in should I be eating a certain way, or I eat a certain way, so that means I have to train a certain way. Training hard goes a long way. And so when we look at, I'm going to graph some stuff out. It's none of this is coming from studies or anything, so there's no scales. There's no numbers attached to these scales, so it's more just conceptually understanding what could be happening there. But if you're untrained, maybe that's the red curve there. And a trained athlete, their carb utilization, sorry, there should be some axes there. I apologize, the image didn't show up properly. But that green one, as you train, what ends up happening is you become better at utilizing fat at high volumes. So that would be on the left side of this curve because we're graphing by intensity. So high intensity on the right, high volume on the left. So on the left side, you can see here we actually use less carbs, which means we're going to use more fats at high volume. So training allows us to utilize fats better, which is going to allow us to have better aerobic performance, better conditioning and endurance. But training also helps us utilize the carbs at higher intensities better. So it's also going to give us better anaerobic performance, better speed, strength, power. Training is good. So don't overthink it. Again, exercise is the forgiver of many sins. You don't need to overthink the nutrition if it's confusing you. Train hard, eat a balanced diet, you're going to be fine. So we're going to go into the dietary piece a little bit more, go down a rabbit hole. But again, at any point, if you're getting confused, remember that you're going to get a lot of just training and eating normal. So don't overthink this. But that's the adaptations to training. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Good for carbs, good for fat utilization, good for volume, good for intensity, good for aerobic, good for anaerobic. Training is good. So don't forget to train hard. You can get away with a lot of other things when you train hard. Now, having said that, let's explore what some of these adaptations to diet could look like, because it can get pretty interesting, but also pretty confusing. So here we have this same graph. If we're looking, going up the left side here, now we're looking at fat utilization. I'm going to graph this by time or by volume again. And so it could look like this. So maybe if we're on a high carb diet, so we're eating more carbs, less fat here, maybe imagine that's baseline. But if you look at high fat diet instead, so maybe we pulled some carbs out of the diet, we purposely consumed some more fat, we're going to get better at utilizing that fat. And that makes sense. You eat more fat, you get better at using it. And over time, that can pay off, because over time we rely more on our aerobic system. We already want to use fats better. And by teaching our body, or kind of having a fat adapted metabolism, we can utilize fats better. So that sounds nice. And so then maybe you're thinking I should just have a high fat diet. You hear about these low carbs, high fats, things like that. But the reverse is also true. So if we graph things out by intensity here, so now we have carb utilization by intensity, and high carb diet allows us to use carbs better. So a high fat diet allows us to use fats better. High carb diet allows us to use carbs better. And specifically, it allows us to utilize those carbs at high intensity. So if you're thinking, I want to go for a really long ride, you don't necessarily need a lot of carbs. Maybe you can fuel off of fat, and having a metabolism that's really good at using fats can be beneficial, but the reverse is also true. Having a metabolism that can use carbs really well is good if you're thinking about doing any high intensity training. So they're inversely correlated again, and remember the reverse is true to either of those. So a fat adapted metabolism is probably a carb unadapted metabolism. So if you use fats well, you might not use carbs as well. And if you use carbs well, you might not use fats as well. So you can't necessarily have everything in this case. It's a little bit opposite of training, where training is good, although you could still get into periodization and interference of different kind of concurrent training effects and things like that. So even that can still get a little messy there. But you can't always have both. So at some point, we may actually start to have to prioritize. Do we want to get good with carbs, or do we want to get good with fat? So that's what we're going to kind of dig into a little bit. So here's a nice chart I really like. And this is looking at carbohydrate needs for athletes, depending on the type of training they're doing. So right up at the top, the sedentary, again, we rely a lot on fat, not a whole lot on carbs when you're sedentary. You're not expending a lot of calories in the first place. So we don't really have carbohydrate requirements for sedentary athletes. Well, they're not really even an athlete if they're sedentary. Maybe you have times where they're an athlete but returning play, but I'm not going to get into that. So if you're not exercising a lot, if you're not doing a lot, you don't need a lot of carbs. And then as we do more and as the training gets more intense, so in this case, we're ramping up both volume and intensity here. So when you're talking about 4 to 5 hours a day of moderate to high intensity training, that's quite a bit. So we're trying to maintain intensity. This could be, in training blocks, really heavy training blocks, training camps. You can see here the carb intake ramps up quite a bit. And 10 grams per kilogram of body weight of carb, that would be if there was a 70 kilo athlete, then they would need about 700 calories or 700 grams, worth of carbohydrates. And then if we do the math, that's about 2,800 calories worth of carbohydrates. So we're talking about when we're in that 10 to 12 range, depending on the size of athlete, you might be talking like 25 to 3,000 to 3,500 calories just from carbohydrates. That's not including calories from fats and the calories from proteins in their diet. So it's a lot of carbs. And I can tell you right now, this is actually really hard for athletes to reach these high levels, but it's also a lot of training. So it's not to say that you have to hit these marks all the time, but you can see here how when we ramp up volume and intensity, when we're trying to maintain intensity, it is very heavily reliant on carbohydrate intake. And so again, intensity, carbohydrate intake, I can't emphasize that enough as we go through this. This is another way to look at it, kind of similar, but not so much in total daily carbohydrate intake. This would be just in training, but it's the same idea. As we do more training here, or as the training gets longer, we should actually be fueling with more carbs. So if you're doing a short little block of training, you don't necessarily need to fuel with extra carbs. And this is specifically referring to the carbs we ingest in training. And as you do more training, you need more carbs. And so often what we'll talk about is like maybe from that 1 to 2 hour mark, you want to consume 30 grams per hour. 2 to 3 hours, we look at 60 grams per hour. And then we start to get those longer training sessions, maybe 90 grams per hour. But this is assuming we're trying to maintain a fairly high intensity. So this is almost counterintuitive to what I was talking about earlier, because I said as you do volume, you're relying more on fat. But what we can see here, and so again, I understand this is not the most intuitive. This is where we kind of go down this rabbit hole a little bit. If we're not fueling, this is that carb curve I showed you before. But if we are fueling, we can actually extend the amount of time we can rely on at least a little bit of carbs. We run out of carbs, often around that like 1 to 2 hour mark, we actually start to run out of carbs. And so by fueling, we can support that system. Now, it doesn't replace the fact that we are tapping into fats quite a bit still, but you can see here that anything when you're doing those longer training sessions, when you're trying to maintain intensity, that little bump that we get from that green line versus the red line can help quite a bit. So again, I know we're trying to tap into fat here and utilize more fat stores, but a little bit of carb fueling can help in this case. So that's why you might hear about those prolonged training sessions trying to rely on carbs, and even if that sounds a little opposite of what I told you before. And so now you might be thinking, well, what about fueling with fat? You said that as volume goes up, we rely more on fat, so why don't we just give ourselves more fat instead of carbs? And that makes a lot of sense, but there are a few tricks and a few reasons why that doesn't work super well. And so this is where it goes back to those digestion rates I talked about earlier. And so, yeah, in theory, our metabolism is really trying to use a lot of fats because it's really high volume. There's a lot of energy in fats, so why not rely on those? We don't need the energy quick because it's high volume. The problem is with that digestion rates. Again, carbs, remember, they digest pretty quickly, less than 2 hours. So you could fuel on these longer rides, and before the ride's over, you can actually start to get the benefits of the carbs you ate. Proteins take a little longer. I apologize for the formatting here. It switched a little, I think, from the PowerPoint. But protein takes a little longer, and then fats actually take quite a long time to to digest. So again, if you're doing like a 5+ hour training session and you start to have a little bit of fat right at the start, you could potentially digest that by the end of the training session. But again, it will take quite a long time. So you need to be fueling with you need to be doing quite a lot of volume, quite a long training session to actually be ingesting fats while you're training and getting any of that actually into your bloodstream. So it takes quite a while. So keep that in mind. The other reason why we often don't look at fueling with fats here is that we have almost an infinite supply of fat kind of stored on our body. And so even someone super lean like this handsome gentleman on the slide here, so even if, like, let's say you're 10% body fat and you're a 70-kilo athlete, I'm just picking numbers here, but just so we can do a little bit of math. So if you're 10%, you're a 70-kilo athlete, that means you have 7 kilograms of fat on your body. Not that you want to use all of that up, but then if we do the math on the energy density, that's 7,000 grams. So 7,000 times 9, because remember there's 9 calories per gram, and you're ending up with around 63,000 calories stored on our body in fat. And there's no way we'll ever need that many calories from body fat. And so again, we just don't really get the boost in performance or maintenance of performance we do from fueling fat because it takes a long time to digest and we don't really run out of fats. So again, carbs digest quickly and we run out in that, like after an hour, 2 hours, we run out of carbs. So when you're talking about doing training sessions longer than that, if you want to even get a little bit of energy from carbs, you're going to have to start to fuel with them. So again, that's why we often fuel with carbs and not with fat. So I know that was a lot of stuff once we kind of really started digging into it. So here's hopefully a bit of the summary. I tried to kind of graph this out for you and allow you to start to prioritize. And whether this is you looking at this from kind of a very micro level, like day to day, or maybe it's like a block of training, or maybe just in general your goals, this can shift, but hopefully it can start to guide you on and kind of pull all of these things I started together into a decision-making process. And so on the left, that column is going to be max intensity, really low volume. Again, volume intensity are inversely correlated, so you can't have max intensity and max volume, right? So this is far end of the spectrum, high intensity, highest intensity possible, low volume. You want to be carb adapted. You want your body to be able to use carbohydrates. However, you don't actually necessarily use a whole lot because the volume is so low. You're not going to run out of carbs. Again, we have a really low volume, so you're not doing like 2 hours steady state training there. So you don't actually need to carb fuel a whole lot, and you don't really ever tap into fat use a whole lot either. So we're going to want to be really carb adapted. So you want to make sure you can utilize the carbs in your body really well. So that would be pretty much a high carb diet. You don't need to be that good at using fat. And obviously I'm not talking about like shifts in body composition stuff. That's a whole different question. But this is just kind of from a performance point of view. So you don't use a lot of fat. And maybe you do a little bit of carb fueling if you're doing a little bit of extended work, but basically max intensity, low volume, its focus is to be carb adapted. Don't worry about fat too much. As we shift to the right, still high intensity, but we're going to start to draw out that volume a little bit. So we're going to try to maintain high intensity, but with a bit more volume. Here's where we're still going to want to be carb adapted. We're going to need that carbs to maintain intensity, but I might start to fuel a little bit more so that hopefully I don't run out of carbs part way and my intensity drops. So I'm going to really try to prioritize that intensity, prioritize that carbs. Again, not focusing on fat too much. This is where it's a little trickier. When the volume is really low, eat well, and you're usually pretty good to go. But when you start to do more volume and trying to maintain intensity, that's where you have to put a little bit of thought into. You have to really kind of consider your fueling. You have to bring foods with you so that you don't crash at the tail end of that training where you're trying to maintain intensity. As we move to the right, or I can't tell which way my hands are going on the screen, but as we move to the right, now we're looking at moderate intensity, high volume. So volume is really ramped up at this point. Intensity has dropped off a little bit. So we don't really need that like top gear. We don't need to maximize our output, our speed, our power, anything like that, we can let our carbs fall off a little bit. And earlier, if you remember, I was showing you that carb requirement chart, and I was saying how hard it is to get to that 10 grams per kilo carbohydrate requirements. This is that opportunity where maybe if intensity isn't needed, like we're in more of a volume block of training, you don't need to maximize intensity. That's a time where you can scale off a bit, even just psychologically sometimes for the athletes, to allow them to just eat a little bit more of a balanced diet, get a little bit more fats in there, not have to push carbs, like not have to eat 5, 6, 7, 800 grams of carbs every day. It gets tiring. Athletes get tired of eating carbs sometimes. And so if the intensity isn't quite maxed out, sometimes this is that opportunity to back off the carbs, get a little bit more of those healthy fats, balance out the diet a little bit, get a little bit more fat adapted. But you probably still want to maintain the carb fueling because, again, you're doing really extended training. And so if we want to maintain even a little bit of intensity there, often some carb fueling can go a long way. Sometimes this is also where they talk about nutrition periodization, or sometimes you'll see even in the literature, they talk about concepts like train high, sleep low, or sleep low, train high. This is a little bit of the idea of we don't necessarily need to be totally glycogen maxed out. Like we don't need to be carb loaded. So it's a little bit of the idea of like sleep low. This isn't a true sleep low. This is kind of like a sleep moderate. But we have some glycogen, but then training high with a lot of carbohydrate availability. So we're still fueling. And so if you ever heard those concepts before, this is kind of what we're getting at. If that doesn't make any sense, don't worry about it. I'm just trying to kind of like put things in context here if you've heard those concepts. So again, you don't necessarily need to have a super high carbohydrate diet, but you still may benefit from some carb fueling if you're doing those prolonged training sessions. And then only when intensity is really low, and I would say I almost never work with these athletes. This is really not like Olympic disciplines, but if you are someone who doesn't really care about intensity at all, but you're really, like you do a lot of volume, like 5, 6, 7, 8-hour rides, ultra endurance stuff. So intensity is very low. At that point, you actually could probably not need as much carbohydrates, and you may benefit from some kind of more fat adapted metabolism. But I would argue still that you're going to benefit from some carb fueling because it's just going to extend the length of time you can rely on that carbohydrate system before you really start maximizing fat use. The other thing I would say is that there's not a lot of evidence that doing this high fat, low carb is actually any better than doing like a more standard balanced diet, even for the low intensity, high volume stuff. So in theory, it makes a lot of sense, and it may be something you want to experiment with, but really reserve that for the times when you don't even need, like when you're doing absolutely no intensity. If you're doing absolutely no intensity, you could maybe play around with these fat adapted, low carb, high fat diets and things like that. But again, I would really reserve that for those unique cases there. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully somewhere along the spectrum you can kind of see where your training falls and start to make some decisions based on kind of your goals, make some nutrient intake decisions. All right, so let's wrap all this up and then we'll just open up for questions. We'll have about 15 minutes still for the end. I know I said a lot, so hopefully this kind of pulls it all together. Intensity and volume are inversely correlated. Really important to remember that if you ever get confused with any of this, as intensity goes up, volume eventually will fall. Now we can play around with those thresholds and we can try to push both as best as possible, but at some point, if you ramp one up, the other falls off, right? So it's really important to remember that, and that's where the nuances of periodized training, periodized nutrition, why maybe one training block you focus on one thing, another training block you focus on another. You can't have everything. Intensity and volume are inversely correlated. Same thing with fat and carb use. So if you're trying to periodize your training, you may want to periodize your nutrition on top of that. substrate utilization at a given intensity is going to depend both on training status and diet. So this is where you can manipulate it a little bit. You can never break that inverse correlation kind of relationship. It's a kind of a physiological law. You can never throw it out, but you can shift exactly where that crossover point happens with your training and with your diet. So you can push it, you can shift it up, you can change the steepness of the curves there. Sorry, I just had a pop-up on my screen to get rid of it. So you can play around with that relationship, but it's always going to be inversely correlated. And at the end of the day, doesn't matter how much you shift it, the nutritional intake is going to depend on that intensity and volume. So I would figure out your training first, layer the nutritional needs on top of that. And when you do that, it allows you to tweak it a little bit, but still really optimize performance with your nutrition. All right, that is all the content I have. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I didn't see any in the chat, but I don't know if any of you want to start typing them in now, and I can answer them. Hey, Kevin. Yeah, so good question. I wish there was like an easy answer for that. Probably not an easy one, but we can kind of talk hypotheticals and then you can make informed decisions, I guess. So there's something called a respiratory quotient, and that is the kind of the ratio of gas exchange. So if we hook you up to a metabolic cart, we can actually test those ratios, and they correlate with, just because of that, like the actual molecular structure, we use more oxygen with carbohydrate. It's kind of the same idea of like how anaerobically we can use carbs, but aerobically we use fat. So if you put someone through kind of a ramp or a step test on a metabolic cart, we can see those differences in gas exchange. And someone who's using more fat will actually see different numbers than someone who's using more carbs. So we can actually start to see fuel utilization as they move through like higher and higher intensities. We can also take a look at their kind of fuel utilization at baseline. So like, are they a 60-40 kind of stuff? That's in theory. Super messy. I've looked at respiratory quotients before, and I never actually know what to do with the numbers. It's like, hey, they look like they're using a lot of fat, but that could be maybe they're just underfueled at that time, and they just don't have a lot of carbs there. So it may not be preferred fuel use. It could just be like fuel availability. So it gets really messy. But in theory, we could pull someone into the lab, and we could actually look at what that curve looks like. And then maybe like test them a month later if we did an aerobic block and see if we ramped up the fat usage. So that's in the lab. Not overly useful, I don't think, in a practical sense. I would say you could kind of subjectively draw some conclusions after doing if you have information on the type of training. So maybe you did an aerobic block and you were someone who's pretty dialed in with their nutrition. You could see if they made really kind of like good gains there, and then maybe if they're anaerobically, they got a little compromised. Maybe you went a little too far trying to fat adapt and you compromised their anaerobic system, but then you could also argue that maybe it's compromised because the training was too aerobic and your training wasn't enough anaerobic. So it's hard to tease those out, but the more information you have, you can start to kind of make decisions based on what you're trying to get, and then reflect on like how well did that go. If you start getting GI issues ever, so if somebody's ever like, you try to make a shift to more carbs and they're like, it's really bothering my stomach, that means they aren't digesting that stuff well. You might actually need to kind of like slowly expose them to that type of diet, and sometimes that takes time. So there's not really any good answer, but subjectively you can start to kind of tell sometimes if someone goes like on a low carb, high fat, and then all of a sudden they want to do high intensity and it's not going well. That's probably a sign that they've kind of adapted a certain way, and it might take them time to carb adapt back to the high intensity. Hopefully that answers your question. It's not really a good answer. I wish we could just kind of test it better than it is, but a lot of this is just kind of mechanistic background stuff to hopefully allow you to make informed decisions. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have a great answer for you though.
So thanks very much.
I know some people would argue that, Kevin, that like I've heard people say that they can pull valuable, reliable data from those respiratory quotients, and they'll purposely put them through a ramp test every once in a while and look what that curve looks like so that they can use fat at low intensity as well, and then still optimize their carb use at high intensities. Again, so I've heard labs do that. I don't know if they're just a lot better than me at this, but I don't trust it still, to be honest. I haven't seen data that I trust yet.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that presentation, Kevin. I'm not too sure if we have any more questions from our listeners, but if anyone else, so Tiago is typing, so we'll just maybe give a few minutes to see if he has a question. But if not, then we may wrap up fairly shortly.
Is that carbohydrate at the end there? So I'll start answering based on what I think the question's asking. I wouldn't go real deep into the periodization with, so yes. Yeah, so I would say it's a good question. I would say at the younger ages, I wouldn't get too into like the idea of trying to periodize the nutrition to optimize adaptations. I would focus on some of the kind of nutritional skills and behaviors and the knowledge early on. You can always chase adaptations at later on, but the reality is like when I talk about here are sources of carbs, a lot of people don't know what their sources of carbs are. And so in theory, yeah, like even a younger athlete could get better aerobic adaptation or better anaerobic adaptation, but the reality is they're probably not going to execute well. Even their like food autonomy, most kids are reliant on someone else to provide the food. So a lot of it, I would say, focus on those kind of upstream, the knowledge, what are carbohydrate foods, how do you cook these foods, how do you store these foods, how do you use a knife without hurting yourself in the kitchen. I would say those probably are more important skills to work on, or even just the idea of carb fueling, like bring a carb snack with you. I wouldn't get too caught up in like 30 grams versus 60 grams versus 90. But if you can start to instill the behavior and the idea of bringing carbs with you or fueling with carbs in certain situations, later on you can optimize the adaptation. You can make those tweaks, go with 60 versus 30 or 90 or none at all. But if they don't even know what a carb is, or they haven't developed the behavior of packing a snack with them, then you can't do any of that even if when you want to. So I would say from a long-term athlete development point of view, focus more on like the knowledge and the skills to instill these behaviors, and then later that sets them up. Like I love when I get an athlete that came out of a younger program and they're like plug and play. I can be like, yeah, you need to increase your carbs, you need to decrease your carbs, I need you to bring this, I need you to do that, and they just do it. Those are dream athletes for me to work with. But a lot of times I have to spend a lot of my work with them saying like, this is a carbohydrate food. So when I say bring carbohydrate food, these are your options. And then I have to chase them out like, oh, I forgot. And they're like, okay, well, you can't forget. What's going to help you not forget? So I go through that a lot with athletes, and it would be like a dream if I didn't have to. So I would say from a long-term athlete point of view, if you can develop those skills early, you can always chase adaptations later. And so you kind of have the second part of that, how to understand when the adaptation should be targeted towards fat and longer efforts. Yeah, I would kind of rule of thumb, I would say focus on carbohydrates. And the only time I would try to chase any fat adaptation is if like intensity is not at all a goal. And I would think of all forms of intensity. So like in the gym, any speed stuff that you're trying to like work on speed, max speed, speed endurance, maintain anything on the bike. Even like kind of intensity in the form of like technical tactical skills, right? Like if you want like perfect execution on something, if you're not going to do that as well if you don't have carbs, right? If you're not good at using carbs, because that requires you to think properly. And so I would say like rule of thumb, get good with carbs, and then maybe down the road there may be a point here and there where you really chase the fat adaptation stuff, but only like in high volume and absolutely no priority on intensity, there might be a situation for fat. That would be my thought process for how to kind of figure out when to target fat.
Okay, well, thank you, Kevin, for answering all those questions. That was amazing. I know that I definitely learned a lot today about carb versus fat fueling and the correlation between exercise time and fat and carbohydrates utilization. So I'm sure our listeners did learn a ton as well. And on behalf of Cycling Canada, we want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to provide us with this presentation. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and partaking in this webinar. We did record this webinar and we'll be posting it to Cycling Canada's official YouTube channel. So please go and check out that YouTube channel shortly, as we will be posting that within the next 24 hours or so. So if you want to review any of the amazing content that Kevin has shared with us today, then that resource will be available through Cycling Canada's YouTube channel. So thanks again, Kevin, for taking the time out of your day to provide us with this presentation. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to our 5th episode. So have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me.